morning, everyone. Welcome back to Eurosatory News. Here we are back. I am joined by Sam HART, which is a land analyst for SHEPHARD Media Defense Insight. Hello, Sam. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Good to meet you, Eloise.
Yeah, nice to meet you. So, Sam, I believe it's your first time in the exhibition.
Yes.
What are your impressions so far?
As exhibitions go, this is larger than any of the ones I've been to so far. So I was at DSCI in September, which was big, but not this big. Then I was lucky enough to go to DSA Malaysia the last month and WDS 2-3 months ago now. But this is just the size of it. I think it's very reflective of the way the land domain is completely changing, as I'm sure we'll talk about further.
Yeah. So yes, you're an expert of armed vehicle market. What can you tell us about the developments that you have been able to observe in the last, let's say, 5 years?
I think 5 years is a really interesting time period to talk about. Obviously, 2.5 years ago now, we had the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that has completely changed the outlook of the armoured vehicles market, the entire land domain for the entirety of Europe. If you talked to me 5 years ago, where did I think the land domain was going to be going? It was going to be small specialisation. Things like the UK's integrated review in 2020 was talking about effectively minimising the amount of armoured vehicles that the British Army had, for example. And I think, well, maybe not to the same scale, a lot of Europe was following that. That's completely changed. I mean, if you look around the show today, even compared to kind of shows in the last year, there's just far more vehicles, platforms, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles. It's just completely changed the outlook of what countries are interested in and the scope and the size of the platforms. We're seeing this kind of renaissance of armoured vehicles in a way that hasn't been seen since the Cold War almost. Things like mass is back is kind of the expression that we're hearing a lot, that countries are now prioritising having large amounts of armoured vehicles rather than small amounts of very good ones. Like an easy way to see this is just looking at kind of the BAE stand today. The one at DSCI back in September was the Mark IV CV90, top of the range, like ATGMs on it, so anti-tank guided missiles. Whereas you see the one today, and while it might be the Mark IV chassis, we're looking at kind of much closer to the Mark III turret on top. So it's how do we create a good platform, but for a lower cost and an easier to kind of produce platform. And I think that's one of the ones we're seeing at the moment, is how do we get these platforms out in numbers, how do we make sure they're also competitive, and how do we make sure that they're financially viable, unlike things like MGCS or these expensive platforms that maybe some other companies would have been hoping for and that countries were vying for. And I think MGCS is probably the biggest potential loser of this, kind of the main ground combat system, that future combat vehicle, main battle tank, halfway through the next decade, and suddenly you've got Leclerc XLR, like the Leopard Arc 3.0. There's all these different the platforms, the Panther as well, that could just be this rival to MGCS in that interim period.
And there have been developments, especially in the Italian program. What do you think of the future of Italian armed vehicle program will look like?
Again, this is one of those where kind of you can see how quickly things can change in a week. So kind of a week and a half ago now, we were looking at potentially the signing of a deal between KNDS and the Italian government for Leopard 2. And suddenly, as of halfway through last week, that deal, the negotiations were announced as having broken down. So as I say, just completely changing the outlook of Italian programs.
What happened?
It's kind of up for contention at the moment. Neither side really want to talk in too much detail about what's happening. But the main kind of view of it then is that Italy's asking for the ability to integrate more Italian systems in it. Have things like CIO as one of the kind of the primes on the platform, a manufacturing plant within Italy, Italian systems, Italian kind of hardware and communications. That KNDS was slightly less receptive. Is probably the easiest way of putting it.
Okay.
And kind of what that then means going forwards then for the Italian programs is they've also got a double bill at the moment with the A2 IS or AICS, a couple of different names floating around for it, so up to 700 placements for its Dardo IFV. And what that could mean then is if something like Rheinmetall decides they want to walk into the front of this, they could do a double ticket of the KF-51 Panther, so their main battle tank they unveiled 2 years ago here, or indeed the Lynx, then the KF-41 as its armoured fighting vehicle. So what we could actually see is, in the space of a week, moving away from a KNDS, who knows what kind of IFV double ticket, to now Rheinmetall taking both of those contracts. So I think it'll be really interesting over the next few days to see if any information comes out, especially kind of on that Italian front.
Given all these past and recent developments, what do you think the UGV market will look like in a 10 years' time, maybe?
I think the UGV market is in a really weird place at the moment. If you talk to any of like the military side of it rather than the industrial, especially the political side of it, where they see the UGVs going and what they actually want the UGVs for is completely different to what a lot of these countries are kind of trialing, developing, playing around with and experimenting with at the moment. So a lot of what the UGVs are being used for is this last mile resupply. So turning them into casualty litters, the ability to transport, I don't know, rocket launchers so infantry soldiers don't have to carry them, instead of kind of using them as armed UGVs in the way that, if we're being honest, that's where conflict will be taking these platforms towards. But what's really interesting is if you look around these shows, there's very few of these logistics UGVs. They're all being used as armed, so either missiles on them, firing loitering munitions into the air, or indeed putting an RWS on them. So companies like Milrem have done that. And I think that's kind of in the medium term, that's the future of the UGV market, is they will become this autonomous fighting vehicle. But if I may get on kind of like a little soapbox here and talk about where I think the UGV market's going to go, I think it's going to get smaller, faster and more lethal. I think we're going to see things like suicide drone bot swarms, using those as kind of ISTAR assets to build battlefield management systems, and just creating that entire feed of information, both in the land domain, air domain, sea domain, everything. It's all going to go autonomous to a degree, and I think it'll be that integration with traditional combined arms maneuver with UGVs is going to be the thing that will completely revolutionize how armored fighting is done. And I think we're just on the cusp of it, and we can see that with some of the platforms. A lot of these kind of future platforms, so like I think it's Hyundai Rotem, they've got a kind of a concept tank out on display. One of the things that's got is like a UAS drone, so that's moving away from UGVs here, but autonomous systems integrated into these platforms, and we're going to see that going forwards, that like how there's loyal wingmen being developed for airplanes, we'll see platforms that will kind of, you could almost put your active protective systems on a UGV, have it following along the tank, and then therefore the tank doesn't need to have an APS on it. I think it's going to be exciting but incredibly scary going forwards to see where UGVs end up.
You think the artificial intelligence will play a big role in this?
I think AI is probably the biggest blocker to the second half of that. So those kind of those swarms or that follow-on technology, that's the biggest blocker. And I think going forwards, that's going to be the biggest development in UGVs, is just the ability to not have to be controlled. A lot of these UGVs we see at the moment, they're either like follow on to a person who's got a transmitter in a pack, which is very low tech realistically, or it's remote controlled. What we're going to see in the future is the ability for these to be fully autonomous in a battlefield situation. I think that's going to be the biggest blocker. But I think the biggest blocker as a whole to UGVs at the moment is the politics of it.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Is there anything, Sam, you'd like to add?
No, really. I think it's going to be a really interesting show. There's a lot of interesting stuff out there. I think going over to a couple of kind of like the new main battle tanks, I think what's on display from places like KNDS, Hyundai Rotem is indicative of the changes in the market, and I think that'll be some of the most interesting things to see that 2 years ago, certainly 5 years ago, we would not be seeing at a show like this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much,
Thank you very much.
Sam HART, and yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you for all these very interesting insights you've
Thank you very
been
much.
able to give us. Thank you.